So let's look at a map of Paris. So the place I was just telling you about, the Holy Innocent Cemeteries, was just here. So I was not lying right in the middle of Paris. Today, it's a neighborhood called Châtelet-Les Halles. So it's really like the main hub of transportation in Paris. So they had solved their first issue of like what to do with all the remains. Now they had to find new places for people to be buried. And this is when they decided to create 3 cemeteries on the outskirts of Paris. So the first one is Père Lachaise. It's just here in the northeast of Paris. The second one is called Cimetière de Montmartre. It's way smaller. It's in the north of Paris, just by Sacré-Cœur. And the third one is in an area called Passy, just here, just by the river. A few years later, in 1824, they're going to create a fourth one called Cimetière du Montparnasse, just here in the south. So remember I told you these cemeteries are on the outskirts of Paris. But if you look at the map, you're thinking, but these cemeteries are in Paris. Well, what is she talking about? So it's true. Today, if you want to go see Père Lachaise, for instance, it's in Paris. What happened is that in the 1860s, Paris grew bigger. Paris used to be smaller, but during the Industrial Revolution, people gathered in Paris. Thousands, millions of people actually came to Paris to look for jobs in the nearby factories. And as a result, Paris grew bigger. So the small villages that initially were outside of Paris became part of Paris in the 1860s. And that's why, for instance, Père Lachaise here is not outside Paris anymore, but in the 20th district, what we call in French arrondissement. So in 1804, the cemetery, the plot of land was purchased by the state, and it's named after the former owner of the land, Père Lachaise. Père Lachaise was the confessor to the King Louis XIV. And so since he was the original owner of the land, they kept the name Père Lachaise for the cemetery. When Père Lachaise was created, there were a couple of challenges. So first, if you've been to Père Lachaise before, or if you heard of it, maybe you know you need to be wearing good shoes when you go over there because it's extremely hilly. It's very steep. But most cemeteries usually are flat, right? It's way more convenient. So this is one of the first things that's special about Père Lachaise, that the 2 people who designed it, Alexandre Brongniart was an architect and Quatremer de Quincy was an archaeologist, came up with this brilliant idea of using the flat part at the top for mass graves, because it was still possible to be buried this way until the end of the 19th century. And they used the steep parts of the cemetery to create more like a garden with individual monuments. So they solved this problem in a quite clever way. Then came another problem. So today we think of Père Lachaise as one of the most beautiful places to be buried. But when it was created in 1804, actually it was very unpopular. And there was a true resistance from the population. People did not want to be buried there because it was seen as too far away from where people used to live. It was too far from their neighborhood. So once again, the owners of Père Lachaise had to come up with a plan and with a good strategy. They're like, okay, what can we do so that people actually want to be buried here? And I think the strategy they came up with is a strategy that could still be used today, because they thought, but maybe people would want to be buried in Père Lachaise if there are famous people here. And so what they did is that they had the remains of famous French writers, French poets, French politicians transferred and reburied within Père Lachaise. So the first 2 celebrities they acquired this way are the playwright Molière, very, very famous in France, and the fabulist La Fontaine. So their remains were both of their remains were transferred to Père Lachaise. And then a few years later, in 1817, they had this monument built, and it's a monument dedicated to a couple called Héloïse and Abélard. Their love story is rather famous in France. It's a cursed love story, kind of Romeo and Juliet style. Just to explain to you briefly why it was such a big deal that the remains were transferred to Père Lachaise. It's because they are known for their cursed love story. Abélard was studying to become a monk, and he was asked by someone working at Notre Dame to be the private tutor for his niece, a young lady called Héloïse. And so he accepted, but the two young people actually fell in love, started an affair. Héloïse became pregnant, and so they secretly married each other. So when her uncle found out the truth, he was so angry that he had Abélard kidnapped, tortured, and castrated. So Abélard spent the rest of his life basically in exile, wandering from monastery to monastery. Héloïse was put in a convent. So they never saw each other again. Today, their fame rests in a series of love letters that allegedly they exchanged during their lifetime. I say allegedly because it's kind of hard to prove their authenticity. But so they're a symbol of cursed love and like eternal love in France. So what the owners of the cemetery did in 1817 is that they had their both the two sets of remains transferred to Père Lachaise, so that at the end, eventually, they are together. And so the remains are within this very nice neo-Gothic structure. So it's a type of architecture that really mimics medieval architecture. It's a beautiful place to go see in Père Lachaise. You often have people there leaving little notes, poems, flowers, in tribute to the couple, or, asking for basically a better love life. So it's a charming place to go see. What I love about this picture is that it really shows that Père Lachaise is like a miniature town in itself. The grid in the cemetery is very reminiscent to the grid in the city. It's very big. It's 120 acres. It's the biggest green area in Paris. There are 6,000 trees in there. And it's also one of the most visited cemeteries in the world. It's hard to tell exactly how many people come to Père Lachaise every year because admission is free, but we think at least 2 million people. When you arrive, you have this type of maps everywhere. So I recommend taking a photo of it. And this way you can go explore and try to find like the most interesting graves in Père Lachaise. So to wrap up this rather thorough introduction, what I really want to emphasize is how Père Lachaise was truly new at the time. Why was it so new? It's because for the first time in the history in France, the grave can become a marker somehow. When you think about the first place I told you about, this horrible graveyard in the middle of Paris, there were no monuments, there were no markers. Once people were buried, there was nowhere to put their name, there was nothing. At best, maybe the family could put a small wooden cross, but it was basically the end of it. With Père Lachaise, for a lot of families, it really becomes a priority to buy a plot of land and to have a tomb designed so that it really reflects the wealth, the personality, the taste, the education of the person who passed away, but also of the entire family. So this explains like this wonderful line by Victor Hugo that I wanted to share with you. Being buried at Père Lachaise is like having mahogany furniture. This is how you recognize elegance. It really becomes proof of status. So to sum up, like Père Lachaise brought so many different types of novelties. So first, hygiene is a priority. It's not religion anymore. It's really hygiene. Then the cemetery is not in the city center anymore. It's in the outskirts. And since it's kind of like far away, it's also the birth of the funerary convoy, and the procession for the families are a way to display their wealth. There is also the idea that everyone is buried together. And this idea of equality is very strong in France after the French Revolution. So the idea is that it doesn't really matter if you have money or not, everyone is buried in the same cemetery. Of course, this equality is kind of relative, right? as often because the wealthiest can afford extravagant tombs, while the most modest, not really. Another novelty, it's not a religious place anymore. Like Père Lachaise is not owned by the church, it's owned by the state. It's the only place to be buried. It doesn't matter what your religion is. So that's why there are graves from all types of religions in Père Lachaise. And last but not least, it's not just a place for the dead anymore. It's a place for the living.